My name is Aimee Code. I am the Pesticide Program Director at the Xerces Society, and we're going to spend the next 30 minutes talking about some of the threats that pollinators face and what we can do to make a difference and help bring them back. So the main risk factors that pollinators are facing today are pesticide use, disease, climate change, and habitat loss. And if you think about those 4 factors, you realize that in each case, humans have a role in those impacts. Therefore, we have the ability to make a difference, to make our own changes to better protect species. The other thing we want to think about is these do not work in isolation. Oftentimes there's a layering effect or they somehow interact. And as I go through each of these threats, you'll begin to see that. The first risk factor we're going to talk about is habitat loss. There's a number of factors that lead to habitat loss. Obviously, we're looking at, urban expansion, also ag expansion. Both of these things are eating up habitat. Pesticide use is another part of habitat loss, where insecticides and other pesticides can actually make areas uninhabitable for pollinators, or maybe with herbicide use we're actually losing the forage plants that are needed because they're being killed off. We also are seeing a number of key plant species being lost as we integrate in other non-native plants into our environment. This urban development and the loss of habitat has additional factors that we need to be thinking about. When you take away habitat, you're actually adding to the issue of an urban heat island. So we're increasing temperatures. We're also increasing the risk of light pollution, which has an impact on our nighttime pollinators, like moths. So when we're thinking about urban habitat and how do we restore and bring back pollinators, we really are looking at riparian areas and parks as a key place to restore and replenish our pollinator species, and making sure that we have migration through those areas. The next topic we're going to discuss is climate change. This is an area where there's a lot of unknowns, but what we do know is really important, and we definitely need to be taking steps as we can to respond to the risks that are being caused by climate change. So first, unknown. One of the things that we're seeing with climate change is there's winners and losers. There are species that do okay in climate change and others that really struggle. Unfortunately, some of the species that are doing really well are our pest species. The very things that make them pests, they reproduce all the time and they're generalists and can be in a large range, makes them thrive even with climate change. Many of our specialists are struggling. And so we're seeing this change in the composition of our invertebrate communities. And one of the things that we can do to respond to that is we can help our beneficial insects and help them be able to move with climate change. So as temperatures are rising and species need to move north, we can help create those corridors and help those areas so that their range can respond to the changes of the climate. Unfortunately, this isn't always the case. If you've got a species that's a high elevation species, yes, they can continue to move up that mountain, but at some point they don't have any place to move to. So there are going to be losers in the case with climate change. Another really interesting thing that we're seeing with climate change is a mismatch, where we actually have pollinators emerging at times when the plants that they need are not flowering. And so we're going to have species that are going to be struggling, wanting plants to be pollinated and pollinators to get the food that they need. So diversifying our plants and making sure we have more plants out there so we have flowering plants when our pollinators are coming out is really a key piece in the puzzle. So disease is another major factor in pollinator decline, and with that is a link with non-native species and competition with native species. So obviously a lot of our native bees potentially could be harmed when you've got honeybees. You've got honeybees that are maybe reared on the East Coast and they're moved throughout the states through pollination season. So that means if those honeybees are carrying a disease, they could be transferring it throughout the whole US. And so being aware of that and trying to find ways to mitigate that disease is really important. Honeybees also can displace and compete with our native bees for limited forage. As we said earlier, we have less forage, less habitat available. If you're bringing in more bees, even if it's short term, you're going to struggle to have sufficient forage for those new bees that have come in, as well as the native bees that are there. But it isn't just honeybees. Even us as conservationists and wanting to do right and bring in bees for our yard, buying mason bees at the store, we need to be very thoughtful. The reality is oftentimes those bees that we might buy at a store to bring into our yard to improve pollinator populations might also be bringing in disease. They might be competing with the native bees that are already there, which is part of why Xerces really encourages creating that habitat that allows the species that are already there to thrive and flourish, more than bringing in other species from other areas. So the last threat we're going to talk about are pesticides, and we are going to go a little deeper into this. It's an area where we get a lot of questions at the Xerces Society about what we can do about pesticide use, and it's a place where we can really make a difference, especially in our urban communities. There's so much to be done to better protect pollinators from pesticides. And when I use the term pesticide, that is an umbrella term. So people think about insecticides and pesticides sometimes as synonymous, but actually pesticides include herbicides, they include fungicides, and even things like rodenticides. So there's that umbrella term as well as the more specific terms. So at the Xerces Society, when we think about pesticides, we look at the number of bee kills that we've seen, the incidents, we look at the kind of contamination we're finding in our pollinator habitat and throughout our environment, and at our core, we feel that current pesticide uses and the regulations that allow those uses are insufficient to truly protect our pollinators. So thinking about that in another way is, if you're looking at a pesticide label, even if you're following that label, it might not be sufficient to fully protect our pollinators. So the way we respond to that is we look for alternative solutions, other ways to move us away and reduce our reliance on pesticides. And I'll talk a little bit more about the solutions, but first let's dive in on pesticides and understand what the concerns really are. So a number of different pesticides can be of concern. Obviously, people are concerned about insecticides. These are chemicals that are designed to kill insects. So an exposure to a bee could lead to mortality or other concerns. But it isn't just insecticides. When we're talking about insecticides, there are some insecticides that are higher priority. A lot of people have heard about neonicotinoids or neonics. This is a group of insecticides that has multiple strikes against it. It's not just that they're highly toxic, that small amounts of these chemicals are going to cause harm for our pollinators and could kill pollinators. They also are extremely long-lived. That means that the window of an opportunity where a bee could be exposed to that chemical is much longer than many of the other chemical classes that are out there. They also are systemic. So they're uptaken by a plant and they move into the pollen and nectar. That creates a direct exposure route. So those bees coming to forage can be exposed to those chemicals, much more likely to be exposed than with some of the other chemicals that might be a contact exposure or other chemicals out there. So high priority insecticide, not the only concern, but high priorities with neonicotinoids. Other thing we need to realize with neonicotinoids is they are used throughout our environment in many, many areas. So this map shows imidacloprid, the very first neonicotinoid out on the market, when it was first introduced in 1994. The last data that we have was 2014. This is the difference. So we have a huge amount of growth in the use of these chemicals. And take into account that these are just agricultural uses, so this doesn't show use by homeowners or in urban areas. So it isn't just insecticides, as I mentioned. Fungicides are also of concern to our pollinators. And this is, I feel like, a really cautionary tale, because if you look at a label of a fungicide product that you go to for managing disease on your roses, or powdery mildew on your squash, you go and you look at that label and say, I need to manage this, but I don't want to harm bees. That label is not going to tell you that these are of concern. Almost all of our fungicides on the market are considered practically non-toxic. That's their classification federally. But as we've been looking at the risks to pollinators, all kinds of new concerns are arising. We're finding that wild bees in agricultural areas, their abundance is dropping when fungicides are used. We're seeing fungicides causing harm similar to that of malnutrition, where bees are no longer able to fight off disease. And we're seeing that these fungicides sometimes if there's an exposure with an insecticide, they actually increase the risk of that insecticide because they block the bee's ability to detoxify that insecticide. And so the bee can be poisoned for a longer amount of time and greater harm can occur. Then we look at herbicides. So the most obvious concern with herbicides is that we're going to be limiting our forage. If we're spraying herbicides in the environment, we're knocking down different flowering plants. The biggest example of this is really in agriculture, where you've got herbicide-resistant crops that are being sprayed continually throughout a season, and they're knocking down different plants. In fact, with that, we actually have seen in the Midwest significant drops in monarch populations because those herbicide-resistant crops are being sprayed so often. We've knocked down milkweed, which is the host plant and necessary for monarchs to reproduce. I want to add that it's important to understand that when we move to organic, it really oftentimes is a lower toxicity option, but it isn't risk-free and it isn't non-toxic. Our organic products can also raise concerns. Oftentimes Xerces does say if you're looking to use a pesticide product, you would consider an organic option, but don't think that you're going risk-free by going organic. I mean, if it's an insecticide, it's designed mostly to repel or kill an insect, and therefore it could be of harm as well. So the other thing that we always need to think about with pesticides, all too often people say, great, I won't use that chemical when bees are present. But when we look at actually how bees can be exposed, there's so many other exposure routes beyond just exposure, direct exposure when there's an application. If there's a bee nesting in the ground, an application could happen and it could move into that nesting site. 70% of our bees are actually ground nesting, and so that is a potential. You could also have an application to a plant, and then a leaf cutter bee or a bee that then lines its nest with leaves could take that leaf that is contaminated and put it into its nest, and the larva could be exposed to that leaf. The systemic pesticides I already talked about with neonicotinoids and other systemic insecticides, you can see that that chemical is uptaken by the plant, moves into the pollen and nectar. Months to years after that application, you could still find levels of neonicotinoids in that pollen and nectar potentially. So there's a lot of exposure routes. It's not just about avoiding that initial contact exposure, although that is important. It isn't the only thing we need to be thinking about. So this is really a wrap up on the threat section, and now we get to move to the solutions, which is a much nicer topic. What are we going to do to respond to these concerns? Just want to remind that the different threats that our pollinators are facing do interact. So it's not just pesticides or habitat loss, climate change or disease. These things are interacting, leading to the decline of our pollinators. So we understand the risks of pesticides. Let's talk about what we're going to do to respond to that, and what can we do in our yard and in our communities to respond to the concerns that we know exist when pesticides are used. At Xerces, first and foremost, we want to reduce people's reliance and use of pesticides. Oftentimes that's in some ways really behavior change and really a new way of thinking. The other thing we're looking at is finding prevention and management techniques that don't require chemical options as part of the solution. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. So the first thing we want to realize is the vast majority of insects are actually valuable. They're providing some sort of ecosystem service for us. So when you see a bug in your vegetable garden, don't immediately assume that it is a problem. It actually might very well be a beneficial insect that you're looking at. In fact, this is an example of a beneficial stink bug actually killing a harmful stink bug. The other thing we need to think about here is that when we do have a pest in our yard and we want to control it, if we pick up a product to kill that pest, we very likely are picking up a product that is what's termed broad spectrum. That means it isn't selective specifically for that pest. It could kill any particular insect, and you're very likely going to be knocking down your beneficials as well. The other thing we want to think about in our yard is that we want insect activity in our yard. If you're creating a pollinator garden, you want to see insects. And sometimes that means you're going to see nibbles out of your plants. Yes, it could be a pest, but it might not be a pest that's actually going to harm your plant. It might just change the aesthetic, or maybe it's a beneficial. You might have a leaf cutter in your yard that's using your plant to line its nest, or maybe you've got caterpillars and you're providing the food for future butterflies. So take a step back and tolerate some what could be considered damage, or leave your area more wild. When we talk about habitat creation, we really don't want it to be fully manicured because we want to be able to provide nesting sites for our pollinators. So, and if you like something that looks a little more manicured, hone that wild area in. Maybe put it somewhere where it's less visible to your neighbors who don't want to see that. But leaving things wild is really a great way to help pollinators. And when we're thinking about our yard, we need to recognize that because of the concerns that these pesticides have, cosmetic use of pesticides really doesn't have any way to fit in with conservation. And if you like manicured areas, you can hone in on a spot in your yard that you want to be manicured, and you want to spend your time and your energy there, and leave other areas less manicured. So we often get questions about, how do I manage weeds if I'm not going to use herbicides? That's always how I've managed weeds, and oftentimes people didn't think of their herbicide use as a problem to pollinators. We're now seeing that there's a different story out there, and there is concern. What do we want to do? The biggest thing that I can tell you is that get rid of those weeds before they go to seed. It'll save you so much time next year. And also, when you get rid of a plant earlier, whether by hand weeding or flame weeding or whatever option you're using, you want to get rid of it early anyway because it's not as established. Also, there's an argument for allowing some weeds throughout your yard. Oftentimes our pollinators, some of their best forage is on weedy plants. Another really core piece of thinking about pest management without pesticides is understanding that we want to get rid of root problems. If you think about pesticides, they're often really just responding to the symptom. The pest is a symptom, not really the problem. I often compare it to having a headache. If you have a headache, you can take an aspirin, it'll get rid of the headache, but it hasn't got rid of the root cause. Do you have eye strain? Is there something else? What's happening that's causing those headaches? And aspirin isn't really solving the problem. Same thing with our pesticide use. So you've got powdery mildew on your squash, you buy a fungicide, you spray it, it knocks down that powdery mildew. Are you still overwatering? Do you not have enough airflow through the area? Powdery mildew is going to come back. You haven't solved the problem. The problem was that your plant is not getting what it needs. You're responding to the symptom. So taking that step back and understanding the root problem is huge. Part of doing that is having really resilient, healthy plants. Put your plant in the right place. I have finally accepted that my grandmother's roses are never going to be in my yard. Because I live in the Northwest, and I've got a mucky yard, and those roses get diseases all the time. So I go back to Pittsburgh and I enjoy her roses, but I don't see them in my yard. They didn't do well here, so I had to get rid of them. It might not be that extreme for you, but if you've got a sunny yard, put in plants that do well in sunny areas. If you've got a shady yard, don't try to grow sunflowers in that shade. Find the plant that's right for your area. Think about your soil pH. Are your blueberries struggling? They need a lot of acid in their soil, so you want to make a more acidic soil for them. Really think about those root causes and not just responding to the symptoms that you're seeing. And when you've done everything you can in your yard and you love what you have, and maybe you've inspired your neighbors, take it bigger. Take it to your city park or to your city councilors and see if they can make a change in your parks to reduce pesticide use, to increase pollinator habitat, to make a difference to eliminate neonicotinoid use, as we explained, because of those multiple factors that make them so detrimental. What can you do to keep changing your community to be more pollinator friendly? And even if you don't go that big, I think the best part of pollinator protection is that we all can make a difference. We understand the risks that are associated, and we can, even by putting in a single flower and being aware and allowing that to flourish, are part of the solution for our pollinators. And this is a quote that comes from one of my colleagues at the Xerces Society, and I just think it really captures it. We can all integrate pollinator conservation into our daily lives. Habitat starts with a single flower. Thanks, Jennifer. And thank you for listening.